Throughout the build of my garden workshop, I made a bunch of cost-saving decisions that I'm very proud of, as well as some big spending mistakes. And I'm confident that no matter what your skill level, or whether you've built a workshop before, you will get something out of this video. So without further ado, I'm Jack, this is Sumeray Builds, and let's get into it. Cost-saving tip number one is to avoid planning permission if you can. And if you're anything like me, you might be kept awake at night at the thought of not complying with planning permission or building regulation. And even worse, how much money you might have to spend doing all of it. Luckily, there is potentially a very simple way for you to avoid going through this process altogether, and it just requires some very simple upfront planning. You see, if you're based in the UK, then your build is automatically classed as a permitted development as long as the internal floor area is below 15 square meters, which for most people building a workshop is plenty of space. I mean, I'm in it now. This is my workshop, and you know, like, I'm over here, there's room, you know, you could throw a cat in it, it's big. I've actually done a whole video on this topic covering every aspect from planning permission to building regulations and even the more tricky areas like national parks. And I do recommend that you check that video out after you're done here, but just know that for most of you, you can avoid planning permission and building regulations altogether by keeping it under 15 square meters on the inside. And here's what you can potentially save. Getting the plans drawn up by a professional can cost you anywhere up to £200. Then actually submitting a planning application is going to set you back another £260. Now, to be fair, with a planning application, you do get 2 attempts. So if they deny it on the first time, you do get a second time to reapply. But after that, you're going to have to pay again. And in terms of building regulations, you're going to need to pay another £200 for a series of sequential visits for a building inspector to actually turn up and make sure that you are complying with building regulations. Plus, if you go down this route, then there is a chance that the building inspector will force you to use different materials, which could up the cost as well. For example, they might recommend that you have to use a thicker concrete base, which will add to the overall cost of the concrete. They might make you put steel reinforcement mesh in there, or they might make you use a certain type of timber that was going to cost more than you were planning on. All of this together can really add up, and by avoiding it, you are potentially saving up to about £600 to £700. And if you're thinking, this sounds like a lot of work, don't worry, because I've got some professionally made plans that are available in the description of this video, but I'll talk more about that later on. Tip number 2 is all about the base.
Because you know I'm all about that bass, about that bass.
Now, every workshop needs a solid foundation because only a fool builds their house on sand.
It was a foolish man that built his house upon the sand.
And you do have quite a few options to choose from, which can get a little bit overwhelming. So let's run through each of the most popular. First up, you've got the option of a raised timber frame. You build a timber frame and prop it up with either postcrete and timber or ground screws. Just a heads up though, from my experience, doing this is like rolling out the welcome mat for rats. They will treat the underneath of your workshop like their very own hotel. Then there is the plastic grid system. This needs to sit on a hardcore base and you'll fill it in with pea gravel to keep it sturdy enough for a workshop. I did a whole video on this, I'll link to it up here somewhere. You've also got the option of patio slabs. Now, you'll still need a hardcore base for this, plus a layer of cement before you can actually put those slabs down. And finally, you've got the option, which is what I went for, of a concrete base. And honestly, this is my favorite. You'll need to do all of the prep work that you would for patio slabs, but instead of laying the slabs, you'll build a timber frame and pour in a good 4 inches of concrete. All of these options will work great, and they do vary in cost and how tough they are to actually install. If you are looking to save as much money as possible, then the raised timber frame or the plastic grid system is going to be the cheapest. Here I've plotted all 4 options on a graph indicating the cost and difficulty of each option, as well as how much I estimate they would cost for a similar size workshop to the one that I built. As I've said, I went for the concrete base, which costs me a total of £1,250, and that was everything from hiring a digger and a driver to get it all dug out, right up to actually putting the hardcore down and having the concrete poured. To be fair, I did have some friends helping me that made it a lot easier, but if you do opt for either of the cheaper options, being the raised timber frame or the plastic grid system, you are going to be saving yourself about £500 versus what I spent. Personally, the only option I wouldn't recommend for the average DIYer is the patio slabs. The reason being is you're not actually going to save much versus the concrete option. And I personally, from experience, think that laying patio slabs is the hardest and most effort out of all 4 of these options. Tip 3 is to save big on timber. And let's face it, you're building a workshop. So unless you are an experienced bricklayer or you've got access to a plethora of steel, you are going to be building all of this out of timber. And this tip is probably the simplest to implement out of everything that I will be talking about. Apart from the last one, but we'll get to that. In order to save as much money as possible on all of your timber, you do need to make sure you sit down before you start building and actually plan out all of the measurements and everything that you're going to need. Then what you need to do is take a trip down to your local builder's merchant. Now for me, that is a store called Heavies. For you, it might be a Travis Perkins, for example. Definitely don't go down to your local DIY store like Wickes or B&Q. Doing this is pretty much always going to be cheaper because a builder's merchant will give you the best discount possible, especially if you're making a larger order. And despite what the name suggests of builder's merchant, you don't have to be a builder or a tradesman in order to walk in. They are open to anyone in the public, so average people like you and me can just walk right in. I spent £1,000 on all of my 2x4s, the 2x6s for the roof, the 18mm thick OSB that I put on the walls and the roof. It was all delivered for free, and from what I could tell at the time, doing a comparison against Wickes, it was about 20% cheaper. So I saved about £200 doing this.
And as a little bonus tip,
If I was to do this again, honestly, I probably wouldn't have put 18mm thick OSB on the outside of the walls. You only really need it to be that thick on the actual roof to stop you falling through it and to make sure that there's enough support up there for your rubber roof. If I was to do this again, I'd probably go for either 12mm, maybe not as thin as 9, and doing this would have probably saved me a little bit of cash. Tip number 4 is, for the love of God, make sure you go for a rubber roof. And actually this tip is unique because it's not really about saving money, it's more about encouraging you to make sure that you don't cut back on this very important area. Let's be clear, the quality of your roof is the only thing standing between you in your nice warm workshop and the elements outside, specifically the rain. If you're letting water get in through your roof, it's only going to be a matter of time before your build starts rotting, and then you're wasting even more money in the long run. Trust me, skipping on this step is just a bad idea. I went for a rubber roof, and I'm incredibly happy that I did. The only thing that I would say is I got a little bit carried away and went for the 1.5mm thick premium option, whereas I could have got the 1mm thick option, which would have done just as good of a job. In total, I spent just over £900 on this stage of the build. However, if I had gone for that thinner rubber, I would have saved myself about £200. Oh, and just another quick tip, if you are buying it from Rubber for Roofs, I did have a chat with them and they did set up a discount code of Sumeray, which will get you 5% off your order. Now, if you really did want to save on your roof, you could consider something like felt. However, I wouldn't recommend it. You're only going to end up paying in the long run with the longevity or lack of longevity in the roof of your build. The next tip is about the windows and doors of your workshop. Now, nobody likes to pay a fortune for doors and windows.
You buy one, you get one free. I said you buy one.
But unless you're planning on teleporting in, you are going to need them. Unfortunately, buying off-the-shelf, brand new windows and doors cost a lot. A brand new French door can cost anywhere from £1,000 right up to £2,000 or even £5,000 if you want those fancy bifold doors. And a window will set you back about £300. The key here is to be open and accepting of the bargains that can be found on Facebook Marketplace, eBay, or Gumtree. This was the approach that I went for, and after about 1 week of searching, I found someone on Gumtree that was selling a really nice second-hand French door for £350. And he even delivered it for me. Also, a few days after that, I found someone giving away an old window, and even though that window wasn't in perfect condition, it only cost me £12.50 to replace the hinges, and a few weeks later I picked up a replacement handle at a car boot for about £5, so in total I spent under £400 on a new window and door, which is an absolute bargain when compared to what I could have spent buying them new.
tip number 6, I think.
Now, cladding was absolutely the biggest splurge that I made building this workshop. I opted for this black composite cladding, which was difficult to install, very expensive, and do not even get me started on the amount of batten that I needed to use to get this ready. But now that it's done, I've got to say that I absolutely love it, and I love the fact that I will never have to maintain it. However, given the topic of this video is all about saving money, I need to dig a little bit deeper here. If I had swapped out that composite cladding for the metal cladding that I use on only the back of the workshop, I could have saved myself a fair bit of cash as well as a lot of time in preparation and actually the installation. And you can get these metal sheets in black, so it wouldn't have really looked much different in the end. Also, if I went one step further and opted for a more traditional looking wooden timber cladding, I could have saved myself even more money. The only thing that you need to consider with timber is that you do need to maintain it. Every 1 to 2 years, you do need to make sure that you treat it with some sort of external paint. Now, in total, I spent,
Get ready for this,
£2,200 on all of the cladding, the batten, and all the accessory bits like the corners that you need when you use this composite cladding. Not to mention, it took me 3 entire weekends as well as many summer evenings to actually get this done. In hindsight, I could have saved nearly £1,200 if I opted for a timber cladding instead, minus the cost of painting it and doing things like that every year for the rest of time. However, even with the maintenance taken into consideration, if your aim here is to save as much money as possible, going for a timber cladding is the obvious choice, and in total will only set you back about £1,000. Time to talk about the electrics. The big tip here is you can save quite a lot of money by doing all of the first fix yourself, which doesn't actually require any scary live electrics. This includes things like laying the cables and installing the back boxes. And clearly you need to do a fair bit of research before you just start throwing cables into the walls. And there are a lot of people online, far more qualified than me, that will show you how to do this. Although I think I did actually do a pretty good job in my electrics video. Because I did all of the first fix myself, including the very hard job of burying the armoured cable in my garden, a lot of the hard work that the electrician would have had to have done, I did, which meant he only charged me for 1 day's work, which was still, I've got to say, an eye-watering £360. Once I added that to all of the cost of materials that I'd spent, the total to actually put the electrics in for my workshop was £922. That included the emergency stop button, the fuse box, and all of the sockets that I've put around the room. And I actually think, unless you are an electrician or you know a little bit more than the average person like me, that is actually a really good price. You probably should expect to pay anywhere from £1,000 to £1,500 if you want the electrician to do everything for you. So mentally prepare for that if you're not going to take on any of this work for yourself. And another bonus tip here, I put in a lot of sockets. Around this room, I've got 15 double sockets, which are 30 separate sockets that I can plug things into. I went over the top because I need to film in here. I might be reviewing a tool over there and I might not want to trail the cables around. You could certainly save a fair bit by reducing the amount of sockets that you've got and just accept that you'll use an extension lead a bit more. That's okay. And the last tip before I talk about the total price and the plans that are available is going to be about the insulation choices that you make. And the insulation that you choose is the only thing between you and the cold weather outside. And sure, you could skip this step altogether, but be prepared that in the winter you're going to be sat in a freezer, and in the summer it's probably going to be way too hot to actually do anything in here. I opted for PIR board, which is arguably one of the more expensive options. But if you do want to save a bit of money here, you could go for cheaper options, which are things like rock wool or polystyrene. In total, my PIR board set me back £600, but if you did go for something like rock wool or polystyrene, you could look at close to halving that spend. And you'll probably install it a lot quicker than I installed this PIR board. Another bonus tip here, make sure you're wearing a mask. I didn't for 1 day and I had a sore throat for like 3 days afterwards, so definitely go and buy yourself a decent mask and make sure you're wearing it, whether you go for the PIR board or rock wool. It's very, very important. But Jack, what did you spend in total building your workshop? Well, I'm going to tell you. Before I go into these prices, there's 2 things that I want to point out. One, this doesn't reflect the amount of friends and family that I had helping me throughout the entire build. If you are going to pay an external labourer, it's going to cost you some money, right? So another tip here, make some friends. Secondly, I will acknowledge that I did have a lot of tools available to me. If there was any tool that I would recommend more than anything else, I'm going to say a miter saw. That really did help me, but if you don't have the budget for a miter saw, you probably could get by with a circular saw. In total, I spent £7,617. And if you implement every single cost-saving tip that I've spoken about within this video, I think you could get the price down to just under £6,000. And if you're sat there thinking,
That sounds really good.
well, guess what? There is a link in the description that will take you through to my website where you can purchase all of the professionally made plans that I used to build my workshop. This also includes a material list as well as step-by-step diagrams to make the build easier for you to follow. And honestly, it is just a really good deal. I've made it super cheap so anyone watching this video can afford it and hopefully save themselves a bunch of cash in the process. Anyway, that's everything for today. I hope you found this video useful, and if you did, I would really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button and smash like. And until next time, happy building.